I'm very glad to be here and having this webinar. Let me just give you a bit of context on why this webinar is starting now and what we're doing with this webinar series on SDGs. So UNDESA launched the World Public Sector Report a couple of weeks ago. And this World Public Sector Report focuses on institutions for SDGs. What does it mean is that we have to look at the institutions cross-section to implement the SDGs. And if we don't look at the institutions as a pillar for the SDGs, we are having less probabilities to achieve the SDGs. So part of this webinar series comes from that World Public Sector Report. And we had a webinar last Thursday, with Aranza, Guillen Montero, and David Leblanc from UNDESA. And then they presented the World Public Sector Report. And this second webinar is about budgeting for SDGs. This is a very important topic, and we have been getting a lot of requests from the GIFT network. Today, I'm going to be part moderator, part presenter. So I'm going to, first of all, introduce my co-hosts, starting with Suren. So Suren has long time experience on transition and developing economies on issues of PFM. He has been working a lot on how to bridge policies to PFM, how to implement program budgeting, performance budgeting, and he is now part of the UNDP, and he is supporting countries in Asia Pacific to improve their budget systems to address SDGs. So he's going to show us some country examples on how they are budgeting for SDGs. He prepared quite a few examples, I think. And part of this is, since there's no one size fits all, so we can show different methodologies, different contexts. And so we have this. And Ramon Narvaez Terron, we together prepared the background paper for this World Public Sector Report. We did a cross-country analysis on how countries are budgeting for SDGs. And Ramon here worked also as part of the Ministry of Finance in Mexico, in the team that implemented the budgeting for SDGs. Why we're making a special focus on Mexico? Because this World Public Sector Report introduces the case of Mexico as one of the more advanced cases of budgeting for SDGs. So we're going to zoom in that case. I am Lorena Rivero, and I am manager for technical collaboration and cooperation at GIFT. And I have long experience also on PFM and led the team that implemented the budgeting for SDGs back in Mexico. So I'm going to start with a presentation. I'm going to be talking about the context of budgeting for SDGs as a cross-country analysis. So it's a broad sense on what we're talking about when we talk about budgeting for SDGs. What do we mean? First of all, I want to go a bit back. The point is, we're not starting in a vacuum. We already have lessons from the MDGs. A lot of progress was achieved towards the MDGs. But one thing that we know is that most countries did not monitor their budget allocations against the SDGs. What this means is that we don't know exactly how the budgets reacted towards the MDGs. And one thing that we know, because there has been research about this, is that the countries that did not align their development strategies to the MDGs were as likely as those that adopted national plans to invest in social spending on health and education. So what I want to emphasize here is that many countries only implemented high-level planning linked to the MDGs. And if they didn't do that, it was the same. So what are we trying to do different this time? So it's not only about how we say that our national planning is connected to the SDGs. It's about how we connect our whole process towards the SDGs. It's not how we present only our budget proposal to the legislative, but how all the stages of the budget cycle connect towards achieving the SDGs and how we monitor implementation in this sense. Strategies for budgeting for SDGs are varied. Actually, one of the ones we have here, and I have this specific one, the International Standardized Budget Classification, was actually a proposal from Suren here, who has developed a lot towards this. And the most common is as well the mapping and tracking budgets against the SDG. This is known as the budget tagging. So what I can say here is that there are different methodologies, different strategies, and these can fit in different stages of the budget cycle. And some of them can be cross-cutting. So when we speak about linking the formulation stage This is deeply interlinked with the planning and programming processes. But something to consider here is that when we are speaking about the programming process, we have to look not only at the budget, but also the revenue and the macroeconomic context. So in the formulation stage, we have to look at it as a whole. And we have to look at incentives, and some of the actions that we can do is the implementation of a medium-term budget framework and a medium-term fiscal framework, so that we have a long-term view or medium-term view of our allocations. The second thing is that budgets should include classifications that enable tracking objectives. So most countries have implemented economic classification. Most countries have administrative classification of some sort. Most countries have already started with a functional classification. What we can know is that most of these classifications, if they are not implemented together with objectives or with program budgeting, how do we know the objectives that we are achieving? So economic classification per se will not give us what we need for, even if we tag the budget against administrative and economic classification, if we don't know the exact activities that this budget is performing, it's hard to know the link with the budget. And finally, this balance between detail and aggregation. So having a detailed aggregation of these classifications will give us a better analysis and better comprehension. So sometimes a higher disaggregation is much better. And mapping the SDGs with the budget, considering positive and negative links and spillovers. So something that has been done in most countries, they're thinking about the positive links towards the SDGs. But we know that this SDG agenda, the 2030 agenda, is very much interlinked in one SDG with another. So some of the effects that we have with one budget program can be positive towards one SDG or one target of the SDGs, but can be detrimental for another one. So this is the easiest case to understand this, is that if we are supporting activities that have to do with agriculture and we are encouraging the use of pesticides, what effect does this have in the climate? So it can be good towards poverty alleviation, toward industrialization, but what effect is this having in the other SDGs? Mapping the SDGs is not only about the positives, but also about the negatives. Some of the challenges that we have to overcome when we are talking about the formulation is that we have different time cycles for national planning or long-term planning and the budget cycle. The budget cycle, when we're lucky, we have a medium-term budget framework of 3, 5, or some forward-looking macroeconomic estimates towards 10 years. Or even 15 years. But usually these are shorter terms than national long-term planning. Are these connected or are they not connected? This is a case of Malaysian vertical alignment. And what we can see here is how the national development plan and the national outcomes connect to the program budgeting and then to the activity. So here we can see an effort to align the budget cycle to the national planning. The program budgeting, and this we can go on in the cases that Ramon and Suren are going to present. They're going to talk a lot more about this, but program budgeting is an important thing to consider if we are talking about budgeting for SDGs. Why? Because it's the moment when we know the objectives for the budget allocations. And as I mentioned before, the economic classification might not be the ideal, or the administrative classification might not tell us all about the activity. So program budgeting is something to aspire to. And finally, it's not a classification, but a focus and a point of view. So we have to understand when we're trying to link the budget towards SDGs at the formulation stage, to check the inputs, the outputs, and how they connect to the outcomes. If we don't look at this in a performance orientation, then we might have a disconnection between the budgeting process and the policy process. In the approval stage, what is important to consider is that many countries have asked, how do we make parliaments use the performance information for the approval stage of the budget? And one thing that we constantly see as well, and this is talking about transparency, what is the information availability? Is the performance information available in time, usable? So in this case, the role of the parliamentary budget offices and independent fiscal institutions can have an important role, but it's important to provide the correct information. In the execution stage, we have the monitoring, and it's important to monitor both financial and non-financial targets. These will allow us, and having the correct information will allow us to respond and adjust as required during the year and not wait for the next year. And it also gives us feedback on what we are going to plan for the next year. And finally, linking the budget of the audit and oversight moment is the Intosai, for example, has released a tool for audit offices to do a readiness of national government to implement, monitor, and report the progress on the SDGs. So this is an important tool that audits have. And also changing and having more performance audits, not just the financial audits. And external evaluation has an important role in this because it can give us important information on how we are going to implement improvements. So there are variations in the degree of implementation of budgeting for SDGs. We have categorized it as the depth of linkage and the institutional change. So we can have countries implementing in different stages of the budgets, and also having different degrees of implementation of the tagging process. So these are the variations of the degree of linkage. And the optimal would be focusing on outcomes. So orienting our decisions on performance-based, having the complete tagging of the budget with positives, negatives, and impacts analysis, and taking this information into account for budget decisions. Because if we have all this information but are not using it, then it's not of much use. So very quickly, from Suren's work, from Heget's work as well, and the voluntary national reviews, we have assessed how 56 countries are doing in the depth of linkage. And one thing that I want to highlight is that most countries have fully implemented in the planning process, but we're doing the same thing as happened with the MDGs. We're focusing on the planning, but little in the budgeting and monitoring phases. And regarding the tagging process of the budget, we see very few countries that have implemented tagging processes for the budget, and none of them that we can say that are actually using it for the budget allocations and policy improvement. So this is some of the things to consider where we are as a worldwide context. Now I'm going to leave this for Suren now. He's going to present some cases in which this budgeting for SDGs is already happening.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorena. Unfortunately, probably I will be a little bit repetitive on some of the very important messages that Lorena has already mentioned. This is quite a common and general experience across the world. What Lorena has mentioned about disconnect between the planning and budgeting, and including on SDGs. And UNDP also was observing the disconnect starting from the MDGs process with all the positive things that MDGs have achieved. The integration of the thinking around high-level goals, high-level policy targets in the routine budget systems was challenging a long time ago, and it still exists in many countries. Similar challenges still exist. So I'll go and present a couple of examples, and not all of them are implemented through the UNDP engagement, but UNDP is closely observing and sort of monitoring what's happening across the world in many countries. So some of the countries we have direct information coming from our personal experience. Some of the information will be general information that is available to everyone, and I will share the relative sort of pros and cons and that kind of information. So let me start with a general statement or key messages that we have been identifying so far, that national budget is an important vehicle to achieve SDGs. And so my colleagues from other part of the world, from the European, Eastern European countries, they have estimated some of the rough estimates about how important a state budget would be in financing the SDGs. And for example, you see the average for 16 countries in Eastern Europe, it's approximately 44%, like nearly half of the estimate that the state budget will have that key role. And in some extreme cases, like the Belarus on the right hand of your screen, it goes up to the 69–70% of the estimate. So that means that in many countries, it will be nearly half of, even more than half of the financing of SDGs going through the state budget. So this is very important. The budgets are very important. But budgeting is not the sole sort of tool to address the financing for SDGs approach. UNDP is currently has already developed, and we're currently engaging in many aspects, and we have identified 7 pillars of financing for SDGs, and budgeting is only one of them. Another general message that if SDGs are not visible in the budget documents in one or another way, then SDG implementation is at risk. So informing budgets on SDGs is important. This is quite important. Also, key message to pass that the informing budget is important. And Lorena also mentioned that many countries are doing budget tagging, and this is important, a very critical step to do. But I'll go a bit later into some of the details. What to do next after the tagging of the budget. Budgeting for SDGs is not a standalone exercise. Some experts perceive budgeting for SDGs as an exercise of SDG costing. So you do just an estimate of how much SDG will cost at high level, or in some cases costing of SDGs at a project level, and that's sort of the budgeting. From our perspective, it's not that. It's not only that standalone exercise. It's about mainstreaming SDGs into government's various business processes and budgeting processes in particular. But unfortunately, we don't have a sort of a silver solution for every country. So no one size fits all. This is our experience, even from our quite an intensive experience coming from one of the SDGs, SDG 13 in Bangkok Regional Hub. UNDP has been has advanced a lot in this particular one SDG area for the last decade. And we also found that even for one SDG, the budgeting approach it's not one size that fits all the countries. We need to have a country context analyzed. I'll just a very quick country snapshots, and I'm very reluctant to talk about Mexico a lot, given we have two experts here from Mexico who have actually done this work. So I'll just very quickly say that the Mexican example is extremely positive one. We always sort of make reference to Mexican experience. It's very advanced compared to most of the countries in the world. Some countries in Europe and other parts of the world who are perceived to be advanced in terms of PFM, they haven't done so far that Mexico has done. So Mexico is a really great example. But I'll leave to prime experts to talk about Mexico. But one important message is that Mexico was using program-based budgeting, which already was in place before starting the SDG budgeting. This is a very significant and very important platform that most of the developing countries do not have. So even though Mexican case is extremely good one, top out of the list that currently the world has, still it doesn't mean that it can be automatically replicated in developing world. Most of the countries don't have that platform in place that Mexico had. Another interesting example for a country that doesn't have a program-based budgeting, but still does something quite similar, at least at the budget tagging level, is Ghana. They are now in a process of implementing, and UNDP is not directly involved here, but I'm just drawing on this example because it's a very interesting example how a country can integrate the SDG tagging into the FMIS, the Financial Management Information System, without having program-based budgeting. So they are introducing the policy objectives as a part of the structural part of the FMIS, and they link and map all the SDG targets to one out of these 5 pillars that you see on the left bottom part of the screen. So it's either economic development, social development, environment, governance, or international community, international affairs. So this is the general structure how they do it. So they have, for one of the pillars, for the economic development, they have sub-components. And for each component, they map a specific SDG targets, and you can see the codes here, how they map it. So it is quite an interesting case that a country even without program-based budgeting can integrate SDG coding into the FMIS. Because One of the examples, which I will be talking a bit later, is Nepal, and they haven't integrated that into the FMIs, but they still have reached some interesting and positive results. Tonga is another case from Pacific, a small island that has chosen to go deeper and focus on one of the SDGs, SDG 13 on climate change. And they are actually addressing the strategic budgeting and budget formulation parts out of the whole budget cycle. So what they're doing is they're integrating SDG 13 into the budget cycle, but primarily on the first two components of the budget cycle. Management of climate change risk is now required as part of the budget submission process by line ministries. It's issued as part of the 2018 budget circular, and it's something that they already are showing good results out of this exercise. This is just an interesting case of a very small island country doing focused approach on SDG budgeting. A couple of quick examples. Pakistan was, again, very interesting case where they have focused on one of the SDGs, again, climate related SDG, and they've integrated that into the FMIS. So they produce budget reports on budget allocations and actual expenditures. They have been engaging media quite actively, and they have done federal and provincial climate public expansion institutional reviews. This is, again, one small example of how you can focus on one of the SDGs. Assam State of India has done mapping of its all budget lines with expected outcomes, something what Lorena already mentioned about, that you can focus at the level of outcome indicators, not necessarily output and below. And starting from 2016, those outcomes are directly linked with individual SDG indicators. It's not a very resource-intensive exercise, but you get the results. You can show to political counterparts, to members of parliament, to decision makers, some mapping of the budget allocations with SDG indicators. Norway is approaching now, and this is the finding from my colleagues from UNDP Banker Regional Hub, who have been analyzing European cases, that they are doing ministerial accountability to be introduced for each SDG goal, and then linking this SDG target with proposed budget allocations. And then the summary will be presented to the Supreme Legislature of Norway to ensure accountability on SDG performance. So we're not talking about SDG coding, we're approaching it same level of informing budgets on SDGs from different angles. A very quick example on subnational level experience on SDG financing is the performance-based grants. So we have multi-sectoral performance grants, SDG 16 related cases from Bangladesh and Mongolia, who again have been shared by my colleagues from Bangkok Regional Hub. So they do specific compliance criteria for vertical grants to subnational level. If these subnational level governments achieve they showcase some progress on high-level governance or PFM processes. But also we have an example of a specific one SDG-related subnational grant system using performance-based grants. In Pakistan, Punjab province, health financing, district receives 30% top-up if they meet specific performance criteria on maternal and child health. So these are just examples from different countries how individual components of budgeting have been working in one country and maybe not other, and vice versa. Now, a little bit more details on Nepal. They again started with SDG 13 long time ago, 7-8 years ago. They have done extensive progress. They've reached a lot of progress on climate. It was the first country to introduce SDG budget coding as a supplement to the existing budget classification system. And it is the first country, together with Philippines, by the way, to introduce something which we can call first citizens climate budget. So to inform citizens about what the government is doing, in relation to that particular SDG. Starting from 2016, Nepal is also doing comprehensive all SDG related budget tagging, and they are from fiscal 2016-2017 fiscal year, they are actually producing information about all budget allocations in relation to SDGs. This is approximately the same time as Mexico did, but the approach that Nepal has been doing is less comprehensive, is less systemic, because unlike Mexico, Nepal doesn't have a real operational program-based budgeting. That's why it's not like the SDG budget, the budget lines are not met with individual SDG targets. They cannot, because they don't have this platform on performance indicators. However, they do a tagging on the relevance of individual budget line to one or the other SDG area out of 17. So this is just a summary result what Nepal presents starting from 2016, 2017 as part of the budget document to the parliament. So you can see that they show the allocations by all the 17 SDGs, but they cannot go down to the level of individual targets. And this is also same Nepal, but looking forward. So for the next 3 years, they have presenting this table where you can see the trends and to estimate whether the government pays more attention on one SDG versus the other. But this is, as I said, is less systemic than what Mexico has been doing. So summary observation from various countries. It's that some countries have initiated and already achieved good progress on informing budgets on SDGs, like Nepal, and even mapping SDGs with individual SDG indicators, like Mexico or Ghana is in process. However, the question to all of us is, does informing budgets on SDGs mean budgeting for SDGs? So, I mean, there's no sort of quick, solid answer, but if I try to do it quickly, it's yes and no. Of course, it's yes, because it's a very good starting point. It's an important starting point, and this is one of the things that we are also recommending as one of the first interventions in countries that we operate, that you need to start informing the budget decision makers, the parliaments, on the linkage between budget decisions with specific SDGs. But it's not enough. And what UNDP is now thinking at a conceptual level and in terms of the theory of change, we're actually approaching it from 3 different pillars. So the first one is the informing budgets on SDGs. Yes, you need to inform the stakeholders. However, you also need to try to influence the budget decisions. Not only informing, but to influence the budget decisions before they get approved by the parliament. And in doing so, you need to improve the strategic allocative function of budgets via SDGs. In countries which have medium-term expenditure frameworks, this is the first primary vehicle that I have, medium-term expenditure framework or medium-term budget frameworks, and try to influence the strategic allocative function of the government at the point when the decisions are being made. And the third component, or third pillar, is try to use SDG targets and indicators as means to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of budgets of the public funds. So we try to combine all these 3 pillars. Of course, in one country, you will be starting from one pillar and maybe going to the next pillar in a few years. In more advanced countries, maybe you will start with all 3 pillars. But this is a context-dependent decision for the reforms, for the experts or teams of reforms. So in terms of the budget cycle, just quickly, I'll run through what kind of general tentative toolkit in relation to individual component of the budget cycle. It's similar to what Lorena presented. It just has 6 components because I just made a couple of additional splits. So for the strategic budgeting, it's the tools would be to integrate SDG financing frameworks and national finance plans into the NTF to do the SDG high-level costing. For budget formulation stage, it will be to try to influence budget circulars and templates to require SDG line justification of the budget proposals. And this is what we are doing in Mongolia right now, and I will talk about Mongolia case in more details. Budget approval, it's presenting SDGs in budget documents for the parliament, budget scrutiny by SDGs, and citizens' SDG budgets. Budget execution, it could be SDG-friendly procurement systems. Monitoring and reporting, budget tagging, mapping SDG targets with budget KPIs, and engaging CSOs in budget monitoring. Again, this is coming from our experience from different countries working on either individual SDGs or all 17 altogether. And for audit and evaluations, public expenditure and institutional reviews, going into deeper analysis of the effectiveness and efficiency, and also even going with social audits. I'm glad to hear about Lorena's information about Indosai, because that's also something that we will be discussing with Mongolian counterparts actually next week on the role of the National Audit Office in relation to SDGs. So how to design the budgeting for SDG model in individual country when you start working on this. So we have big 5 questions to start with that we need to ask ourselves and our national government counterparts. The first question is why? Why you want to initiate this budgeting for SDGs, and who will be the primary user? Because you can have a country which has a very strong executive and less stronger parliament, and then your shift in accents on the momentum will be more with the executive branch. And that I'm not suggesting this is good or bad. What I'm saying is that you need to take into reality the country context and focus your interventions with the area which provides most of the momentum for the reforms. So it could be limited number of users, it could be all domestic users, and in some cases you also want to address issues with international audience. The second question would be who will be the main responsible agency or political person for implementation, delivery of the budgeting for SDGs. Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Or it's centralized with only a couple of SDG relevant ministries? By saying centralized, I mean Minister of Finance primarily, or planning institutions. What is covered by SDGs? As I showed in a couple of examples, there are countries which have been focusing on only one SDG area. Some countries will decide to do wider. Before the budget decisions are made, during the process of budget formulation, or after, and it makes a big difference how you intervene in terms of the reforms. The answer to this question is a very important one. And the final one is how. So you're doing with a small number of experts sitting in centralized agency and doing some ad hoc and expert analysis. And I brought an example of Nepal where it's not integrated into the FMIS, but they still can present whole budget distribution by SDGs. Or Mexican case, when you have a very sort of systemic approach, how to the systems actually define the SDG relevance of the budget. So now a little bit more on Mongolia's case, which right now is one of the countries that were deeply involved with budgeting for SDGs. So the first step we did with Mongolia is that we try to map out all the challenges that exist in the country in terms of budgeting for SDGs. It was new to many stakeholders, so we analyzed the demand side of it, the supply side of it. So this is the first step to understand the problem tree. The second step would be to identify the reform strategy and present this as a recommendation to the government. And we have this three-tier ladder. On starting with piloting in one sector, then going more deeper into the process with something which we tentatively call SDG informed budget. So it's just to inform the budget about SDGs. And only the third tier, we will be aiming for SDG based budgeting when we go into more detailed and bottom-up budgeting processes. And what we did in Mongolia already in the last 12 months is that we mapped the SDG indicators with budget performance indicators. So this is now to inform the parliament members. So it's informing the budget component. We also went into more and we introduced and changed, and I'm grateful for our counterparts from Ministry of Finance of Mongolia that quickly picked up the recommendations, and within just a few weeks' time, they changed their budget template. They introduced a new budget template requesting the pilot agency and then later for other ministries to justify the budget proposal using the SDG language. So using the causality, using all of the budget justification language and scope of justification, using the program-based budgeting culture principles. Expenditure trend analysis, and you see some of the results of it when one of the findings was that we investigated the outcomes of specific SDG indicators in different provinces of Mongolia, and we tried to map it with budget decision making. And we noticed that sometimes it's not, the budget allocation does not represent the severity of the problem by individual provinces. So this is a finding that Ministry of Finance took quite seriously in further thinking. And a few minutes ago, I presented the 5 big questions. On the left side, you see these 5 questions in the table. When we were doing the actual work with Minister of Finance, these 5 questions were brought down into 15 more detailed technical questions. And Minister of Finance and other national counterparts were deciding on each technical area, minimum, midpoint, or maximum level of efforts. And you see the shaded areas that the government's choice was, the Minister of Finance choice was how to proceed with the reforms plan. In Nepal, we also did quite extensive analysis of the situation, and for budgeting for SDGs component, the new SDG project identified 5 areas. So it's policy budget bridge in line ministries, it's SDG informed budget allocative function, it's the third one is SDG informed communication of line ministries or line departments at the provincial level. The fourth element would be SDG informed communication with the parliament, and fifth one is expenditure monitoring and reporting using SDG targets. So you see, when you go into the country context, you approach it differently. Same conceptual framework was used for both Mongolia and Nepal, but we came up with different results and different set of recommendations for each country. So just to summarize, again, I will repeat, no one size fits all. No single best practice country to use as a universal approach. Each country's progress is great, but addresses different parts of the budgeting processes. So we need to learn from all the countries, but we need to tailor the reforms recommendations in each country using the country context analysis. Budgeting for SDGs cannot be implemented without national stakeholders. Forget about it if Minister of Finance is not engaged. And the final point, budgeting for SDGs will be easier to implement in countries with operational program-based budgeting, like we have the case of Mexico. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Suren. So one of the things that I want to emphasize then is one thing that we see in common. There's no unique path, but one unique thing that we need to keep in mind, the information needs to be used. So if we're doing all this budgeting and all this effort, is to actually use it for policy and budget analysis. So the level of detail that we're gonna need, or the efforts that we're gonna do, need to consider this. And a second thing is we need to focus on outcomes, right? But let's go with Ramon so that we can cover the presentation on how it was done in the Mexican context. The Mexican context, of course, had a program budgeting, but there's a long history surrounding it, and Ramon is going to give us the details. I'm glad to see that some of the team that was part of this project is connected, so welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. As we've already mentioned, I will share with you the Mexican case, what we did at the Ministry of Finance of Mexico to have this tagging with the budget and the SDGs. First of all, I would like to highlight that the objective of doing this whole process was to try to map current efforts, what we were doing, what policies we were implementing that were addressing the SDGs. And in the long term, to be able to use that information, as Suren mentioned, to improve the budgeting process and to have better incidence on achieving the SDGs. This was a coordinated effort between the Office of the Presidency, the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit, where I work, the UNDP, and we also have the collaboration of all federal agencies and entities. There are three main pillars for our tagging model. The first was national planning, the second, a programmatic structure based on budgetary programs, and third, a performance evaluation system. And as already Lorena mentioned, this was an ongoing process. It isn't that Mexico had a really strong history of PFM system. It was an ongoing process of making better things, and I will try to explain each of these steps that we take to be able to tag the budget with the SDGs. So these are the results, just like to have a general idea. Already Suren mentioned some of these results. But in general, we were able to map, since the budget process of 2018, the number of budgetary programs that were linked to SDGs. And there was only 7.7% of the SDGs that were not covered by any of our budgetary programs. Some of them because we have no incidents, like the insular states targets, and some of them because we need to address them in other ways. And we have an 80.7% of budgetary programs that were linked to at least one SDG. So these are the general results. But now I will explain how was this process conducted in detail. The first part that we tried to do was to link our national planning to the SDGs. The idea of this is to try to link objectives with what we should do for the SDGs. And like the broad base that we could find were the national goals from our national development plan. This was a relatively new process in Mexico. The national development plan was from 2013 for the administration of 2013 to 2018. And we managed to have a vertical integration of our national planning with the budgetary programs in 2015. So it was a relatively new process. And actually the same team that was conducting this integration of the budgetary programs with the national goals is the same team that was conducting the process for the SDGs. So it was really useful to be working on that first and then to be able to have this base. But as you can see, it's not that we had a long history of tagging our processes to the National Development Plan. This was an innovation in 2015, and we managed to build a linking process for the SDGs based on this. But this wasn't enough. As you can see in the example here, this is a program from the Ministry of Education called Competency-Based Program to Develop Human Resources. And this program, according to its link to the National Development Plan and the programs derived from that plan, should be tagged only into the Quality of Education SDG. However, this also sets the ground for having impact on SDG 8, on decent work and economic growth, because this program, its intention was to link the education system in Mexico with the market, with the job market. So linking with the national planning, it's good, but it wasn't enough to have this complexity that we wanted to reflect and to really be able to measure the outcomes that we were achieving. So the next step was, at what level are we going to do this tagging? And we use different budgeting classifications, as Lorena already mentioned, and she also answered a bit of that in her question in the chat. The administrative classification was good, but in a responsible unit, in a particular sector, there are different goals that we are trying to achieve, so it's not enough. It was useful to coordinate the efforts with the different agencies, so we used the administrative classification for that. The economic classification was our next step, and we managed to do some proposals of even like how much percentage of the salaries that you are paying and that are going to this administrative unit are going to address certain SDG or certain target. It was a good classification. We had a lot of detail, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, what we really wanted to do was to be able to measure outcomes. And with the economic classification, we could know like this goes to subsidies, this goes to salaries, but we don't really know like what were the results that we were managing with that budget. It's not that we only needed to know how much we were spending on that, but to use that information to improve our expenditures. So we decided to go with the programmatic classification. We tried also some shifts with the functional classification, but the best was to use the budgetary programs as the base for the tagging and for the analysis, because they are linked to a specific objective, and that's what we really wanted to achieve. The next step that we conducted was, okay, we have this general picture, we have the tagging with the National Development Plan, but that's not enough. We now are involving the agencies, so we have to have a common ground. We have to speak the same language, because coordinating federal agencies or subnational governments, there was a question about that, requires to speak the same language. So what we did was to create a guide. All of the images in my presentation that will be available for you have hyperlinks to the documents, so you can consult them. Some of them are in Spanish, because that was like the process, like the law that we tried to implement. But we managed to create some guidelines, and in those guidelines we included sub-targets, types of contribution, and a glossary. These were like the three main features of to guarantee the precision. Sub-targets are important because, as we will see in the next slide, some of the targets of the SDGs are too broad. If we only manage to link our budget with the goal, we wouldn't really be able to know what's really happening there. Even with the target level of the SDGs, it's too broad in some cases. And maybe you are having an impact there, but you don't really know how. Maybe it's because of your program, maybe it's not, because you are not really addressing the specific issues that we are trying to cover with the SDGs. So for 60% of the targets, we create a catalog of sub-targets, dividing them to be able to to track more specifically what we were doing and the impact that we will be having. The type of contribution was also important because in some cases there's a direct contribution where you can link directly a budgetary program with the outcome that is achieved with the SDGs. But there are other cases where this impact is indirect. So the same example that I used before, like maybe it has a direct impact, this program, on the education, but it also sets certain conditions to have improvements on the quality of the jobs and economic growth. That's why we introduced the concept of indirect contribution. This is the example of sub-targets, and as I mentioned, a target can be really broad, and we managed to create a catalog dividing each sub-target. We also create an institutionalization process. We did this with the guidelines for the process of programming and budgeting for 2018. So there was a binding regulation to do that. We also integrate our monitoring and evaluation systems into this process by analyzing indicators, the current indicators that we had for our budgetary programs, and try to see some matches or changes that we needed to do to be able to track the indicators of the SDGs. And finally, we adapt our financial management information system, the FMIS, to include a model to capture the selection of the SDG, the targets, sub-targets, and the type of contribution by each budgetary program. So this was in a system, and from that system, we were able to have reports in open data that are publicly available at the Budget Transparency Portal. You can also have the link in the image, and with the same information that we had on the system. Just to conclude, the way in which we managed to do this, I think, has to do with certain requirements. It wasn't a process, a really straightforward process, as you might think if you only see the results. But we needed political support in first place, and we managed to have this with the president announcement in April 2017 that the budget would include the SDGs. It was also a holistic PFM integration. We managed to try to include all the stages of the budgetary cycle in this, not only the budgeting, but also the planning with the National Development Plan, also the monitoring and evaluation system with our indicators matrix by budgetary program. And also we had some tools like the legal requirements, as I already mentioned, to make this happen with the agencies, and the institutionalization process. In this point, it is useful to use things that the agencies, the public servants are related to. So we didn't create a new system. We used a system that we already had, and we just adapted it, but people already knew how to use it. And finally, we had a lot of collaboration. It's important if you have like big human resources, a good team working on this, it can be useful. But our team was about like 6 people maybe, but not all of them working at the same time on this. Like the core team was Lorena, me, and some other people working on indicators, some other people working on other things. So it's more about commitment and have the political will and support to do it than having like big structures. And that's it. Thank you.
So some of the things that I wanted to highlight about the Mexican case is the soft targets process that allowed to identify specific parts of the SDGs, because we can see the SDGs that are super broad. And if we want to make decisions with the information that we get, the soft targets were very useful. Line ministries sometimes asked us, how do I connect my small program to this big thing? So going towards targets and then sub-targets help them also to give them peace of mind that they were not going to the whole thing, but to a piece of it. So it also helped us to get the line ministries on board on this, and also to identify it. Another thing, of course, the system and making it part of the budget cycle. And finally, the thing that we have, the spillovers that I mentioned in the presentation. So one program can impact many SDGs or many targets of the SDGs in different levels. So that's something to consider in this process. And that I say because I have been looking at some examples, and we have been looking at some examples of processes in countries that are already working on this. And sometimes they are limiting the option that you connect to one SDG and not to another. So since the SDGs are interconnected, that's something that we need to take into account as well. So I wanted to, I'm just gonna give a couple minutes in case there are some questions. There was one question by Gustavo Merino here. So his question, and I think, Suren, for what you have seen, I think it will be great if you could address this question, is in case of federal countries, how can we deal with this situation, not only national budget, but also subnational levels that can implement policies to reach the objectives of the SDGs? And he says that the problem in Argentina is that the coordination needed to do this is so hard that nobody wants to take, to assume it. So it's not about how individual state governments do this, but how they coordinate also with in this federal level. So.
Oh, well, that's a very important question. In many countries, that would be the one of the first questions to ask. I can't give a sort of universal solution to this, but just coming from the experience, general PFM experience, the more you go down to the level, at subnational level and community level, the better program-based budgeting or performance-based budgeting operates because it's much closer to people. The monitoring systems are easier, etc., etc. But in relation to the federal versus, I mean, the cooperation between the federal and subnational levels, or central and subnational level things, I brought an example of the performance-based grants. This is one thing that we are also considering in UNDP, that you can break down the SDG targets by subnational level or by provinces, and then link some of the vertical grant system with the achievement of it. I brought an example of it in the presentation, but I mean, it's without knowing the country context, it's difficult to give a general advice. And primarily our team, at least our team that I'm part of in Bangkok, we work at the level of central governments in most of the cases. There are only a few exceptions that we operate with subnational level. So unfortunately, I don't have the proper and full answer to the question.
So from what we saw in Mexico as well as so you have the different levels, right? The programs that they are implemented with their own budget, but also the transfers to the subnational governments. And here we can have a problem of coordination, and in most of the cases, a problem of information. So how much information do we have on what they are finally spending this money? So we have the cases in many countries of the conditional grants and the non-conditional grants, but lack of information going up to the national level. So one of the things that you would first need, I would say, is that you need to have this information. Otherwise, it's difficult to make a decision and coordination. And also looking at timings. So different political momentums and what is your moment of interaction. So rather, of course, as Suren is saying, there is no one case because it's a specific context, but considering timings and considering the flows of information from one level to the other, it's one of the things that I would mention. I don't know if there are any other questions. Otherwise, we are definitely over time. And it was great to have you all here. I see people are still connecting. I see Charlie from Afro Leadership here, just connecting. Taylor, Mitzi. Unfortunately, we're finishing this webinar at this point, but don't worry, we're going to download it, edit it, and upload it on YouTube. And of course, we are available for any further questions. We, as always, from GIFT, will try to connect you to the specific stewards that are working on this and how they are attending this process, because it's an ongoing process. No one has it all solved yet, and I don't think anyone is going to have it very soon. So we can work all together, share our experiences, and improve each case with the other one. And please share your knowledge and your lessons. And it was great to have you all here. Thank you very much, Suren. Thank you very much, Ramon, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.